Homeless woman saves millionaire from a burning car after a serious accident, but she didn't expect what he would do when he woke up and saw her by his side in the hospital. John Harris was known to many as a successful man, owner of a vast fortune built over the years through hard work and smart investments. He lived in a large mansion in an upscale neighborhood, surrounded by luxury and sophistication. However, none of that mattered to him anymore. His life, once full of ambition and achievements, lost all meaning the moment his wife Emily passed away 10 years ago. Since then, John had lived an existence marked by a deep emptiness, a silent pain that accompanied him every day. Emily had been the love of his life, the one person who made him feel complete. They had shared unforgettable moments, trips, deep conversations, and plans for the future. Although they had tried for years, they were never able to have children, a reality they both eventually learned to accept. They had each other, and that seemed to be enough. But when Emily fell ill suddenly and within a few months passed away, John's life changed forever. From that day on, the mansion that once echoed with Emily's laughter and presence became cold and silent. John stopped receiving visitors and slowly distanced himself from old friends and acquaintances. Work, which had once occupied much of his attention, no longer interested him. He delegated the management of his businesses to others and began dedicating his time to helping those in need. In some way, he felt that by offering financial assistance and support to those in need, he was honoring the generosity of Emily, a woman who had always cared deeply for others. Yet, despite these good deeds, the emptiness continued to eat away at John. He felt his wife's absence in every corner of the house, every lonely morning, and every sleepless night. The memories of the past were becoming more painful with each passing day. Life seemed to have lost its purpose, and the burden of loneliness was becoming increasingly difficult to bear. The opening scene of the story shows John in his most painful routine, visiting Emily's grave at the cemetery. It was a ritual he had faithfully kept every week, as if being close to the place where his love rested brought him some comfort, however fleeting. The cemetery was located on a quiet hill, surrounded by old trees whose leaves rustled gently in the afternoon breeze. John always arrived at the same time just before sunset, bringing fresh flowers to lay beside Emily's tombstone. He would spend long minutes in silence, staring at the name etched into the cold stone, feeling the ache in his chest. But that day, something felt different. John was more melancholic than usual. As he gazed at the tombstone, he began to speak softly, as if having one last conversation with Emily. "I miss you so much," he said, his voice breaking. 10 years without you, and it still feels like yesterday. Every day that passes, I feel like I'm drifting further away from you, from everything that really mattered." He remained there for a few more minutes, lost in thought. John's life had become a constant waiting game for the moment he could finally join his wife. He no longer feared death. In fact, he was ready for it. In recent months, he had accepted that his time in this world was coming to an end, and the thought didn't scare him. "Soon, Emily," he murmured. "Soon I'll be with you." John slowly stood up, leaning on his cane. The weight of age and sorrow made him walk slower than he once did. He gave one last glance at Emily's grave and began walking toward his car, parked along the cemetery's path. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun began to set, creating a melancholic beauty around him. It was a stark contrast to John's state of mind, as he felt completely disconnected from that beauty. When he got into his car, he let out a deep sigh, placing his hands on the steering wheel. The empty mansion awaited him, along with another lonely night, but as he drove along the winding roads back home, his thoughts were far away. He was so absorbed in his memories that he didn't notice the sharp curve approaching fast. At the last second, he tried to swerve, but it was too late. The sound of metal twisting and the violent impact echoed through the air as John's car crashed hard into a pole. His body was thrown against the steering wheel, and everything went black. The impact of the accident was violent, leaving John Harris' car partially destroyed, with the hood crumpled and smoke beginning to rise from the engine. The crash had thrown John against the steering wheel, rendering him unconscious immediately. The airbag had not been enough to fully cushion the blow, and he remained motionless, his head tilted to the side with a thin trickle of blood running down his forehead. That afternoon, there wasn't much movement on the roads around the cemetery. The area was quiet and isolated, and the few people passing by hesitated for a moment when they heard the sound of the collision, but quickly carried on with their business, lacking the courage to approach the wrecked car. However, just a few meters away, a woman clearly heard the crash. Sarah Thompson, 40 years old, was sitting on a curb seeking shelter with her 10-year-old son, Michael. They had just finished eating at a piece of bread they had received earlier, as they usually did every day. Sarah, who was already accustomed to life on the streets, had sharp eyes and quick survival instincts. Upon hearing the deafening sound of the accident, she immediately looked in the direction of the crash and saw the scene that no one else was willing to confront. "Michael, stay close to me," she said firmly, as she quickly stood up and started running toward the wrecked car. Her heart raced as she approached the vehicle. Sarah wasn't a woman with many resources, but her spirit was immensely strong. Despite all the difficulties she faced daily living on the streets, she had a courage that few knew. As she got closer to the car, she smelled the smoke rising from the engine. The hood was hot, and the sound of cracking indicated the engine was on the verge of giving out. Sarah crouched down, and looking through the shattered window, she saw John Harris unconscious in the driver's seat. His face was pale and marked by the impact. Without wasting any time, she tried to open the driver's door, but it was jammed by the dented metal. Desperate, she ran to the other side of the car and, luckily, managed to force the passenger door open with a strong push. She didn't hesitate for a second before climbing into the car and, with effort, unfastened John's seatbelt. His body was heavy and limp, but Sarah, with all her strength, pulled him out, dragging him across the seat until she managed to get him out of the car. Once outside, she laid John on the ground and stepped back, taking deep breaths while watching the smoke grow thicker. She knew she had done the right thing. Any more time in that car could have been fatal. "Can someone help?" she shouted, turning to the few people who were watching the scene from a distance. "Please, call an ambulance." Her voice echoed with urgency, and finally, a woman passing by decided to stop and pull out her phone. She made the call while Sarah checked if John was still breathing. He was alive, but very weak, his breathing irregular. Michael, holding his mother's hand, watched everything from close by, his eyes wide with worry. To him, seeing his mother act with such determination was impressive, but also concerning. Life on the streets had taught them to be careful, not to get involved in situations that could worsen their circumstances. But at that moment, Sarah wasn't thinking about anything but saving the life of that man. Minutes later, the sound of ambulance sirens filled the air. The vehicle emerged from the corner, and the paramedics rushed out, running toward John. They checked his vital signs, placed him on a stretcher, and efficiently carried him to the ambulance. One of the paramedics, looking around, asked, "Is there anyone who can come with him to the hospital? Relatives? Acquaintances?" Sarah, still out of breath and covered in sweat, stepped forward. I can go," she said hesitantly. "I don't know him, but I was the one who pulled him out of the car. He can't be left alone." The paramedics exchanged quick glances, but were more concerned with getting John to the hospital as soon as possible. "Get in," one of them responded, "but you'll have to wait in the waiting room once we arrive." Sarah looked at Michael and, without a second thought, firmly took her son's hand. "You're coming with me, okay? We're going together. Everything will be fine," she said, a mixture of concern and determination in her voice. Michael nodded silently, sensing the seriousness of the situation but trusting his mother completely. Sarah and Michael climbed into the ambulance and sat next to John. The doors closed and the ambulance sped off. During the ride, Sarah glanced at John, still unconscious. She didn't know who he was, but she felt she needed to be there for him. In her mind, it didn't matter if he was rich, poor, young, or old. What mattered was that he needed help, and she, by chance, had been in the right place at the right time. When they arrived at the hospital, John was rushed to the emergency room, where the doctors immediately began examining him and preparing for surgery to repair the internal damage caused by the accident. Meanwhile, Sarah and Michael were directed to the waiting room, where they sat down, exhausted and in silence. The white, cold room contrasted with the warmth of the streets, and Sarah looked around, feeling a mixture of anxiety and uncertainty. Michael beside her curled up in the chair, resting his head on his mother's shoulder as if seeking some comfort. Sarah wasn't sure how long they would have to wait. She didn't know the man she had saved, nor did she know anything about him, except that he seemed completely alone. Somehow she felt connected to that loneliness. Spending so many nights on the streets with Michael had taught Sarah that loneliness could take many forms, and John's, even without knowing his story, seemed deep. Time passed slowly as she waited for news. In the back of her mind, a growing concern began to surface. What if this man didn't survive? What would happen to him? He had no one, and somehow she found herself worried about that. Over an hour passed before a doctor finally entered the room, wearing a calm but serious expression. Mr. Harris made it through the surgery, but he'll need some time to recover, the doctor said. Sarah let out a sigh of relief. Although still anxious, knowing that he had survived brought her some peace. Does he have any family? Someone we can contact? The doctor asked. Sarah shook her head. I don't know. I found him at the accident. I don't know anything about him. The doctor paused briefly, looking at Sarah with curiosity. He seemed surprised that a stranger was so involved. Well, he'll need someone to look after him in the coming days. If you want to stay, you can see him when he wakes up. It may take a few hours. Sarah nodded, not quite sure what to do or expect. She glanced at Michael, now fast asleep in the chair beside her, exhausted from the long night. Maybe it was better to stay for now. They had nowhere else to go, and the hospital offered at least some temporary shelter. And so Sarah decided to stay, waiting for the man who, by a strange coincidence, had crossed her path and unexpectedly changed her night. The hours passed slowly in the hospital. Sarah remained seated in the same hard chair in the waiting room, watching Michael sleep beside her. The silence of the early morning was broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps from doctors and nurses moving back and forth. While Michael rested, Sarah stayed awake, reflecting on the strange turn her night had taken. Her concern for the man she had saved, whose name she still didn't know, kept her alert. She didn't know what the future held for him, or for her and Michael. Finally, as the first light of morning began to filter through the hospital windows, a nurse approached and called for Sarah. "The man you brought in is waking up. If you'd like to see him, you can go into the room now," the nurse said with a kind smile. Carefully, Sarah stood up, trying not to wake Michael, who was still deeply asleep, exhausted from the previous day's events. She covered him with a blanket she had found folded in the room and followed the nurse to the room where John was being kept. Upon entering, Sarah felt a mix of nervousness and curiosity. The room was quiet except for the faint beeping of the heart monitor tracking John's vital signs. He lay in the bed, still pale and fragile, but his eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a distant expression. When the door opened and Sarah stepped inside, he slowly turned his gaze toward her, confusion clouding his face. "Hello, sir," Sarah began timidly. "I'm Sarah. I was near the accident, and I pulled you out of the car before it got worse." John blinked a few times, trying to make sense of what was happening. His mind was still foggy, but Sarah's words began to register. He tried to speak, but his voice came out weak and hoarse. You saved me?" He frowned, his expression showing disbelief. Sarah nodded slightly, taking a step closer to the bed. "Yes, your car crashed into a pole. The engine started smoking, so I pulled you out before it was too late. The ambulance brought you here, and I came along to make sure you were okay." John remained silent for a moment, absorbing everything he had just heard. The sensation of being alive still felt surreal. He vaguely remembered the moment of the crash, the pain, the sound of the collision, and then nothing. The mere fact that he was conscious seemed like a miracle. He looked back at Sarah, trying to decipher who this woman was, someone who had intervened in his life so decisively, despite being a stranger. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice still weak but sincere. I don't even know what to say. You saved my life." "There's no need to thank me," Sarah replied with a modest smile. "I just did what anyone would have done." John let out a soft sigh, still processing what had happened. He glanced around the room, realizing for the first time where he was, and a familiar sense of emptiness began to creep up inside him. Where am I? And why are you here with me? You're in the hospital, Sarah explained calmly. When they brought you in, the paramedics asked if there was anyone to stay with you. I didn't know if you had anyone, and it seemed like you didn't have any relatives or friends they could contact. So my son and I stayed here. John frowned slightly. Your son? Yes, Sarah replied, nodding toward the door. Michael, he's out in the waiting room, asleep. He's 10. We were both nearby when the accident happened. John felt a surge of curiosity mixed with surprise. A woman living on the streets with a young son had risked her life to save his. He couldn't understand why someone with nothing to gain would do such a thing. You've been here since last night? He asked, his voice a bit stronger now. Sarah nodded. Yes, we've stayed the whole time, waiting for you to wake up. We didn't have anywhere else to go, so it was better this way. John, hearing those words, felt an unexpected wave of compassion. He was a man who had spent years using his fortune to help others, but now he found himself face to face with someone who had helped him, without expecting anything in return, in a situation where his wealth had no immediate value. You don't have a home? He asked, trying to better understand Sarah's situation. Sarah hesitated for a moment, as if afraid to expose her vulnerability, but eventually decided to be honest. No, sir. Michael and I have been living on the streets for some time now. We try to find shelter whenever we can, but it's not always easy. That's why, when the hospital offered a place to stay while you were in surgery, I accepted. At least here, we have food and a roof for a few days. John closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. The world was an unfair place. Here he was, a millionaire with no one, with an empty house and no purpose, while this woman and her son wandered the streets with no place to sleep. Suddenly his own loneliness, which had seemed unbearable, paled in comparison to the struggle Sarah and Michael faced every day. He opened his eyes again, looking at Sarah with a grateful expression. I don't know how to thank you, Sarah. You didn't have to do any of this, but what you did, it saved my life. And now I feel like I owe you something. Sarah shifted uncomfortably at the offer. I didn't do this expecting anything in return, she said quickly. I just wanted to help. I don't expect you to do anything for me or my son. John smiled weakly. I understand, but even so, I feel like I have to thank you somehow, and helping you and Michael would be the best way to do that. At that moment, a nurse entered the room to check John's vitals, interrupting the conversation for a few minutes. She adjusted the monitors and asked John a few quick questions about how he was feeling. After the brief visit, the nurse left again, leaving John and Sarah alone. John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the situation. As much as he was physically recovering, his mind was restless. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's kindness in the stark contrast between their lives. She, who had so little, had risked so much for him, and he, who had everything materially, was completely alone. The paradox was striking. I have no one, Sarah, John said, breaking the silence. My wife died 10 years ago, and since then I've lived alone. I have no children, no relatives. All the money I have, it feels empty now. The truth is, when the accident happened, I was coming back from visiting my wife's grave. That's what I do every week. I'd already accepted that I was alone, and in a way, I was waiting for my time to come. Sarah listened to John's words carefully, but didn't know what to say. His loneliness was something she could identify with on some level, though hers was always wrapped in the presence of Michael. Still, it was hard to imagine how someone who had so much could feel so empty. John slowly turned his head to look at her, with an expression of resolve. I need to repay what you did for me, not just because of the accident, but because you made me see that maybe there's still something left for me to do, that I can still help someone in a meaningful way. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out. For the first time in a long time, someone was offering more than pity or silent judgment. There was genuine feeling in what John was saying, but Sarah still didn't know what that meant for her and Michael. And in that hospital room, two lives, one marked by loneliness and the other by struggle, were about to intertwine in a way neither of them could have ever anticipated. The days in the hospital dragged on slowly. For John, each morning was a mix of relief at being alive and a strange feeling that somehow there was still something unfinished in his life. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah and Michael, whose unexpected kindness had altered the course of his days. As his physical recovery progressed, something deeper was happening in his heart. Sarah and Michael visited John every day at the hospital. Michael, always curious, wandered around the room while his mother talked to John, inspecting the medical equipment and asking questions about how everything worked. He seemed to find some sort of refuge in that place, away from the uncertainties of the streets. The constant presence of his mother and the controlled environment of the hospital were a stark contrast to the harsh and unpredictable life he knew. John observed this relationship between mother and son with a certain reverence. It was hard for him to understand how someone like Sarah, who had so little, could maintain such unwavering strength and love for her son. He noticed the little gestures, how Sarah would adjust Michael's hair, or the way the boy followed her with trust, never complaining about the hardships they faced. John, in turn, couldn't help but feel an increasing desire to do something for them, to repay the help he had received in a way that truly mattered. One late afternoon during one of their visits, John watched as Michael played a simple game on an old cell phone while Sarah sat in the chair next to his bed. The silence between them was comfortable, as if there was a mutual understanding that, no matter how difficult the world outside was, in that room they found a brief respite. "Sarah," John began, interrupting his own thoughts, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you did for me." Sarah looked at him, unsure of what he wanted to say, but waited in silence. She had learned over the years that rich people often had second thoughts or felt obligated when it came to giving help. Still, something about John seemed different. Maybe it was the loneliness she saw in him, something that, in a way, mirrored her own. "I know you didn't do this expecting anything in return," John continued, "but I feel like I owe you a debt, to you and Michael. You both gave me something I thought I'd never have again, a second chance. And if you'll let me, I feel like I can do something for you in return." Sarah hesitated for a moment. She didn't want to seem ungrateful, but she also wasn't comfortable with the idea of depending on someone else. "Mr. Harris," she said calmly, "as I told you before, I didn't do what I did expecting anything. I'm just happy that you're okay, and that's enough." John shook his head with a faint smile. "I understand, but please, hear me out. For the last 10 years, my life has been lonely. After my wife died, I stopped living, really. All I did was bury myself in work, in donations, trying to fill a void that nothing, not even money, could fill. But ever since the day you saved me, I've started thinking differently. For the first time in many years, I feel like I can still do something meaningful, something beyond just donating money without ever meeting the people I'm helping." Sarah stayed quiet, listening attentively. John continued, "I don't have any heirs. We never had children, and all my closest relatives are gone. So what I'm left with is material wealth, money, properties, businesses. And being honest, I've never felt more empty than I do now, realizing that none of this will really matter in the end. I always imagined that all this would just go with me when I died. But you made me see that maybe I can use what I have to do something good, something concrete." Sarah was still processing what John was saying. She knew he had good intentions, but she had never seen herself as someone who needed someone else's charity. Despite all the difficulties, she had always tried to be strong for Michael, to find solutions on her own. But at the same time, she knew that any help they received could mean a real change for her son's future. John, sensing her hesitation, tried to reassure her. "I'm not talking about charity, Sarah. I see you in Michael. I see the strength you have, the care you have for him, and I'm amazed. You saved me without knowing who I was, without asking if I had anything to offer. And now I feel like I can do the same for you. Not as an obligation, but because it gives me a sense of purpose, something I thought I'd lost." Sarah lowered her eyes, emotional, but unsure of how to react. It wasn't easy for her to accept help, especially from someone who lived in a world so different from hers. But as she looked at Michael, still playing with his phone, Something inside her shifted. She realized that this offer wasn't just for her, it was also for her son's future. And as proud as she was, she knew that sometimes accepting help was the only way to ensure a better future for him. I don't know what to say, Sarah finally broke the silence. I guess I never thought something like this could happen to us. I've always tried to do my best for myself and for Michael, but life on the streets is hard. If you really think you can help us, I accept your offer. Not for me, but for Michael. He deserves a chance. John smiled, a genuine smile, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Then it's settled, he said with a sense of relief in his voice. When I leave here, I'll make sure that you and Michael have a safe place to live. And more than that, I'll help build a new life for both of you. Sarah, still cautious, felt a weight being lifted from her shoulders. For so many years, she had carried the responsibility of protecting and caring for Michael on her own. But now, for the first time, there was a real hope that things could get better. In the days that followed, the bond between the three of them grew stronger. Sarah and Michael continued to visit John daily, and he, in turn, felt more connected to them with each passing day. John began to share stories about his life with them, his memories of Emily, the challenges he faced building his fortune, and how for so long he had felt purposeless after his wife's death. Michael, who had been shy at first, began to open up more around John. The boy asked curious questions about John's past, about what it was like to be rich and live in a mansion. John laughed at the boy's honest questions and began to see him almost as the son he never had. This new friendship not only filled the emptiness inside John, but also gave Michael a male figure in his life, someone present and attentive, something he had never had before. As time went on, the hospital became not just a place of physical recovery for John, but an emotional refuge for all of them. Sarah felt safer there, with the promise of a better future becoming more real every day. And John, in turn, found hope in the small conversations, the shared laughter, and most of all, in the idea that he still had something meaningful to offer with the time he had left. John knew his recovery was progressing, but his aging body also reminded him that he didn't have all the time in the world. And so on the seventh day, he made an important decision, one that would forever change the fate of all of them. On the seventh day, the sun shone softly through the hospital windows, but the atmosphere in John Harris's room was tense and solemn. He knew that his recovery was going well, but he also felt something different that day, a sort of premonition. Time seemed to move at a different pace, and John, despite his mental strength, felt an increasing weakness in his body. He knew that his health was hanging by a thread, and the fact that he was still alive was, in part, a miracle. But there was also the undeniable reality of age and physical decline. John woke up early that morning, more introspective than usual. Sarah and Michael had not yet arrived for their visit, but he had already made a crucial decision. He knew he needed to act before it was too late. Feeling the weight of this decision, John called a nurse and asked her to contact his lawyer, Mark Collins, requesting that he come to the hospital as quickly as possible. Mark Collins had been John's lawyer for many years. Loyal and discreet, he had always handled John's financial and legal affairs, knowing every detail of his fortune in the absence of heirs. When he received the call from the hospital, Mark immediately understood that something serious was about to happen. Without wasting any time, he left the office and drove straight to the hospital, worried about the urgency of John's request. While waiting for Mark to arrive, John remained silent, gazing out the window. He thought about Emily and all the promises they had made to each other during their marriage, and about the future they had imagined together. They had never thought their story would end this way, him, alone in a hospital bed, with no one to share his final moments except for a woman and her son, who until a week ago were complete strangers. But in a way, fate had brought Sarah and Michael into his life. And for the first time in a long while, John felt that he had the chance to do something meaningful, something that truly mattered. Not long after, the door to the room opened and Mark walked in. He was a middle-aged man with a serious expression and a leather briefcase under his arm. Upon seeing John lying in bed, he immediately sensed the gravity of the situation. "John," Mark began, his voice filled with concern. "How are you? I got your message and came as quickly as I could." John nodded, grateful for Mark's presence. Thank you for coming so quickly, Mark. I need your help to resolve something very important. His voice, though weak, carried a clear determination. Mark moved closer to the bed and pulled up a chair, sitting beside John while opening his briefcase and taking out a clipboard with important documents. Tell me what you need, John. I'm here for whatever is necessary. John took a deep breath and began to explain. Mark, these past few days, my life has taken an unexpected turn. I met someone, a woman named Sarah Thompson, and her son Michael. They saved my life after the accident. And since then, I've been thinking a lot about what to do with my assets, my properties, and all the money I've accumulated over the years. Mark nodded, listening attentively, but still unsure where this conversation was headed. I don't have any heirs, Mark, John continued, his voice growing weaker. And you know that for years I've donated much of my fortune to charities. But now, I feel like I can do something different, something that has more meaning. I want to leave everything I have to Sarah and Michael. Mark blinked, surprised. He had known John for years and was well aware of how much he had struggled with loneliness and the loss of Emily. The idea of John leaving his fortune to a woman he had known for just a week seemed, at first glance, a little sudden. However, as he saw the resolute expression on John's face, Mark understood that his client had found a personal and profound reason for this decision. I understand, John, Mark said calmly. We can amend your will to reflect that. I'll need a few details about Sarah and Michael, and we can make the necessary changes today. John nodded. Yes, do that, Mark. I don't know how much time I have left, but I want everything to be settled before it's too late. Sarah and Michael deserve a better future, something I can offer them. And I feel that by doing this, I'm honoring what Emily always wanted, for me to use what I have to do good. Mark pulled out the documents already prepared in his briefcase and began reviewing the changes to John's will. He asked the necessary questions about Sarah and Michael, ensuring that all the details were properly recorded. Throughout the process, John remained focused, although his breathing became heavier as time passed. Once the will was updated and signed, John relaxed a little. There was a visible sense of relief on his face. He knew he was doing the right thing, and more importantly, he knew that even though his life was nearing its end, he was leaving behind a meaningful legacy, something that truly mattered. Shortly after, Sarah and Michael arrived at the hospital for their daily visit. They found Mark leaving John's room, giving Sarah a nod before saying goodbye. As they entered the room, Sarah noticed that John looked weaker than he had the day before. There was something in his eyes that suggested a deep fatigue, but also a sense of peace. Good morning, John, Sarah said with a gentle smile, sitting in the chair beside the bed as Michael stood next to her. How are you feeling today? John smiled, though it was a tired smile. I'm fine, Sarah. Much better now that you and Michael are here. There was a brief pause before John continued. Sarah, I did something today. Something I hope makes sense to you. I made an important decision about the future. I called my lawyer and changed my will. From now on, everything I own, my properties, my fortune, will be yours. I want you and Michael to have a new chance, a new life, something you both deserve. Sarah was stunned, shocked by what she had just heard. John, you didn't have to do that. I didn't do what I did expecting anything in return. John nodded with an understanding look. I know that, Sarah, and that's exactly why I'm doing this. You gave me a reason to keep going, showed me that there's still kindness in this world. This is my way of saying thank you and of ensuring that you and Michael have a secure future. Sarah felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, surprise, and even a bit of fear. What did this mean for her and Michael? How could they handle such responsibility? I don't even know what to say, Sarah murmured, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. You don't have to say anything, John replied with a weak smile. Just accept it. It's the least I can do. Suddenly, John's breathing became irregular. His eyes, which had been filled with resolve, began to close slowly. Sarah immediately noticed that something was wrong. John, she said, her voice trembling with concern. John, what's happening? He tried to speak, but his voice was too weak. The monitors beside his bed began to beep, and Sarah rushed into the hallway, calling for help. A team of doctors and nurses hurried into the room, asking Sarah and Michael to step outside. Sarah grabbed Michael's hand and stepped into the hallway, where they waited, anxious and silent. Time seemed to drag on. The hallway was cold and empty as Sarah held her son's hand tightly, trying to find some comfort in his presence. A few minutes later, a doctor emerged from the room, wearing a somber expression. He looked at Sarah and slowly shook his head. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could, but Mr. Harris didn't make it." The doctor's words hit Sarah like a blow. She felt tears streaming down her face as she held Michael even tighter. John was gone, leaving behind not just his kindness, but also the final gift that would change their lives forever. The hospital corridor seemed endless as Sarah and Michael waited in silence, trying to process the devastating news of John Harris's death. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. He didn't make it. Despite all the suffering and the fight for life, John was gone. Sarah felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. In such a short time, John, a stranger until then, had become an important figure in her life and in Michael's. He had seen them amidst the crowd, offering not just his generosity, but something far greater, a real chance at a new beginning. As she tried to contain her tears, a nurse approached and gently touched Sarah's shoulder. "John's lawyer, Mr. Collins, is here. He asked to speak with you," she said, her voice soft but firm. Sarah nodded silently, holding Michael's hand tightly as she followed the nurse down the hall to the room where Mark Collins was waiting for them. When she entered, she saw the serious expression on Mark's face. He stood up to greet her and offered a small, polite smile, trying to show compassion during this difficult time. "Sarah," Mark began, pulling out a chair for her and another for Michael, who sat beside his mother. "Before John passed away, he made some important decisions, as he mentioned to you before he died. He wanted to ensure that you and your son had a better future." Sarah remained silent, listening intently. It still seemed surreal that someone like John, with all his wealth, had chosen to leave everything to her and Michael. She had barely known him, yet somehow they had connected on a deep level during that week in the hospital. Mark continued, "John amended his will this morning. He named you and Michael as the heirs to all of his assets. This includes his mansion, bank accounts, investments, and all the properties he owned. I'm here to ensure that everything is done according to his wishes and to provide you with all the legal support you'll need." Sarah was speechless. What John had done was far more than she could have ever imagined. Just a week ago, she and Michael had been living on the streets, struggling to find a safe place to sleep each night. Now she was about to inherit a fortune she had never even dreamed of. The enormity of the situation hit her hard, and she began to feel the weight of the responsibility that came with this gift. I don't know what to say," Sarah murmured, still in shock. "This is too much. It's all too big for me." Mark smiled, understanding her feelings. "I know it seems overwhelming, and it's a huge change for both you and Michael, but John trusted you. He believed that you would make good use of this inheritance, and I'm here to help with the whole process." Michael, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. "Mom, does this mean we don't have to live on the street anymore?" He looked up at Sarah with hopeful eyes, searching for confirmation. Sarah, still emotionally shaken, looked at her son and smiled. "Yes, Michael. It means we'll have a home. We won't have to sleep on the streets anymore." She hugged her son tightly, feeling a wave of relief and joy mixed with the sadness of losing John. In the following days, Mark Collins took responsibility for managing the transition of John's estate to Sarah. He accompanied her through the signing of the documents and explained every detail of what was being transferred. Among the assets, the most impressive was John's large mansion, located in an upscale neighborhood and surrounded by well-maintained gardens. The thought of living in such a grand place was almost unimaginable for Sarah, who hadn't known what it meant to have a real home for years. When the day finally came to visit the mansion for the first time, Sarah and Michael were taken there by Mark. As they arrived at the entrance to the property, Sarah momentarily lost her breath. The house was enormous, with tall windows and an imposing facade, surrounded by towering trees and a sprawling lawn that stretched all the way to the gates. Michael, upon seeing the place, stood in awe, his mouth open in amazement. "Mom, is this all ours?" he asked, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Sarah nodded, still in disbelief. "Yes, Michael, this is where we're going to live now." She looked at her son, feeling a mix of happiness and relief as she saw how excited he was. After years of uncertainty, they would finally have a place to call home. Entering the house, Sarah walked through the wide hallways, admiring the classic architecture and the elegant furniture that filled the rooms. Every detail of the mansion seemed to reflect the care that John and Emily had put into their lives. There were old photographs on the walls, memories of happy moments that John had shared with his wife. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she saw those remnants of the past, but she also felt a deep gratitude for everything John had done for her and for Michael. In the days that followed, Sarah began adjusting to her new life. Mark Collins handled all the legal and financial matters, ensuring that Sarah had access to John's bank accounts and explaining how the investments would be managed. Although the money provided security, Sarah was determined to use it responsibly, just as John would have wanted. As time went on, Sarah started thinking about how she could honor John's legacy. He had used his wealth to help others, and she wanted to continue that work in some way. Inspired by the kindness he had shown, Sarah made the decision to create a foundation in John Harris's name, dedicated to helping homeless people and families in need. It was her way of repaying the generosity that had changed her life. The John Harris Foundation, as it was called, started with a clear mission: to provide shelter, food, and support to those who, like Sarah and Michael, were lost and in need of a second chance. Using part of the inherited fortune, Sarah invested in purchasing abandoned buildings, which were transformed into shelters for struggling families. She also created educational and job reintegration programs, helping people rebuild their lives and regain their dignity. Michael, now attending a good school, also became involved in the foundation's work. Although still young, he understood the importance of what his mother was doing and wanted to help. He began visiting the shelters and talking to the children who lived there, sharing his own story and offering hope to those who were still struggling. Sarah and Michael's lives had changed drastically, but they never forgot where they had come from. Every new day in John Harris's mansion was a reminder that kindness and generosity could transform lives. And above all, it was proof that a single act of courage, like saving a stranger from an accident, could trigger a chain of profound and positive changes. Sarah, now at the head of a foundation that helped hundreds of people, felt more fulfilled than ever. Although she still felt the sadness of John's loss, she knew that he had found peace in his final moments, knowing that his fortune was being used to do good. With each new project and every family that found shelter, Sarah felt she was fulfilling the promise she had made to herself: to keep John's memory alive and continue the legacy of kindness he had started. And so the story of John Harris, Sarah, and Michael did not end with death, but with a new beginning. A beginning that brought hope, change, and, most importantly, the reminder that kindness, no matter how unexpected, has the power to change lives forever. Did you like this exciting story? So don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. Comment below what you would do in the character's place, and enjoy watching our other stories full of twists and surprising endings. See you in the next video.